Hey everyone, welcome back if you've been following, and welcome to Creating Shifts podcast and blog. Welcome to 2024. If you've been following, you'll notice something's missing. I shaved over the holidays, and something new is happening, which is the set. And in this particular episode, starting off 2024, starting off a new tone with what this space is going to be. Not a completely new tone, but just kind of taking it to the next octave. I have my friend Amber B. Pagaling with me, who I want to introduce as a friend and as someone who I have always had really great conversations with. We've known each other for years. And this conversation to me, I want it to be the first of a series of conversations that either are just her and I, or her and I interviewing future guests on this. She is a guest today, but she's also to me a kind of co-conversationalist in ways that I wanted to have her keep coming back and doing a few of these this year in 2024. The years just seem to kind of define themselves. This podcast started about half a year ago, 6 months ago. The first half of 2023, I spent doing the Sacred Commerce podcast with my friend Rowan Gabrielle, really focused on the conversation that she and her husband, Ayman Suaf, put into their book, Sacred Commerce, A Blueprint for a New Humanity. I spent the first part of 2023 really working on getting some really important conversations on record for that platform. And then the second half of 2023, and with the big AI explosion that's been happening and all these large language models and these text to image generation technologies that have been sweeping the world, I felt like I was being called to revive my Creating Shifts platform, which has been in existence for 25 to 30 years with a lot of different names. And the idea of this was that I got from Joseph Campbell and my studies of Joseph Campbell that the artist could be considered a mystic with a craft, and that mystic with a craft could be serving a community. And for millennia, that's what they've done. They've served their tribe, or they've served their culture of some form or another. The myths, the gods, the energies, that any type of way that those insights could be translated into a visual or a sonic form, some way for the internal to become external and shared with others. And Joseph Campbell believed that we are in a time of great global transformation. He passed away in 1988, so this was even before the internet. But he saw that, we were becoming one world community, and that there were no myths, there were no narratives that were speaking to that. So this podcast, this platform, is really geared towards awakening and inspiring and supporting artists of all types. And we'll get into what that means here in a minute after Amber can introduce herself. But artists of all types who want to be part of that narrative forming of the new global community that sees this world that I have behind me as the Holy Land, the whole world as the Holy Land, as Joseph Campbell would say, and all the people on it as the chosen people. And so that's really what I did the last 6 months leading up to December. I really focused on releasing a series of interviews exploring that. And then, in 2024, I want to take that to another level. This world is on fire in a lot of ways, and it's blossoming in a lot of ways, and they're happening at the same time. And one of the reasons, there's many reasons why I want Amber on, but one of the key ones is just her mind fills mine in certain key ways around taking the concept that I start feeling around, and then she goes, "Oh yeah," and she'll start applying very almost technical language around it that I just love hearing, because it gives me another way of seeing myself in ways that, where in other conversations it could just be attention, or it could be a competition to see which idea is brighter or more insightful. And for me, I just always find that our ideas grow brighter when we talk with each other. So thanks for listening to that whole thing. Amber, please share a bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. Thanks. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I just want to begin with thanks and gratitude for all of the people and ancestors, and that made it possible for me to be in the world and to be able to say that I am who I am. I am the result of all that has nourished me in that way. And yeah, so basically I am right now living in Columbus, Ohio, unceded Shawnee, Ojibwe, Wyandot, Miami territories. And my mom lives out here. My mom moved outside of the state of California in 2004. And I really have not had enough time with her since that, because of work or her work or whatever. I think if you stacked all the days together, it would be like 18 months worth of time over almost a 20-year period because of various obligations. So I'm out here to, experience living outside of all I've ever known, which is living in Ventura, Ohio area, and San Luis Obispo. But yeah, I'm living out here right now, and it's very cold. It was like 4 degrees.
That's insane. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I really like the cold in the winter versus, my bestie in, last year, my bestie at like December 30th or something called me and told me she walked into her house and it was like 102 degrees or something in her house. I was like, oh gosh. So
do you like the cold? Did you say you like the cold?
I do prefer the cold to something like that, to like 100 degrees in the middle of winter, like over that, that's a lot. But yeah, I'm living out here and getting to know the community out here. And I often describe, because people are like, what? Why? They don't understand. Columbus is to the rest of Ohio a lot like Austin is to Texas, or Seattle is to Washington. Like they are kind of like, they're a bit, I don't know, they're very much in contrast to the surrounding rural areas, that, in my opinion, and others do say this, but yeah, there's really interesting stuff happening out here that's a lot of fun. And anyways,
yeah, I love hearing the stories that you tell, because it does sound very much like a very vibrant, conscientious, emotionally intelligent place.
Yeah, we do. I like this couple days ago, I just did a workshop on where they did authentic relating. And I really love doing that, and I feel like that sort of thing is essential to my growth as a human being, and being supported. Like I got very triggered at some point during that workshop, and I was lucky enough to be in that kind of community and in that space where a friend of mine was able to like come up to me and check in with me and hold space for me to experience and process my grief, and grapple with and hold really hard things in the midst of that. And that's really where that's the kind of thing I want to be a part of and involved in. But basically, getting back to like I guess what compels me in the world. I am an artist. I graduated in '05 from Art Center College of Design with a BA in illustration. I did that for maybe 1 or 2 years and then quickly kind of realized like, oh, there's not enough community and there's not enough impact
Mm.
in my presence of what I want to be about and in the presence of community that was not there for me. It was sort of like I kind of realized that I was going to be getting my day in the sun or selling paintings and that was going to be that like that was going to be all there really was to a career artist, and it just
Right.
didn't settle with me and I got really depressed.
Mm.
And oddly enough, in the midst of this really profound depression or spiritual crises, as I kind of frame it, I was 27 years old, which a lot of artists commit suicide actually at 27 years old. I found out 10,000 days. That's 10,000 days on the planet.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a make or break point, I feel like, for artists of being 10,000 days on the planet. And that's when I hit my spiritual crisis. And I was so deeply depressed. And
Mm.
not that I don't still experience depression, but not like, oh God, no, not like I did in my 20s. But yeah, I remember going distinctly into a grocery store, a very well lit grocery store late at night. There's maybe 5 people in the whole grocery store. This was back when we had Albertsons. I'm
Mhm.
like almost 43 now, so it dates me. But there was an Albertsons, I think, and I'm walking through the store. I'm in the middle of the aisle when this would happen. It happened 3 times, which is an interesting number. But this happened 3 times. I'm in the middle of an aisle of a very well lit, bright, like fluorescent lighting everywhere.
Mm.
There's no shadows. And a person would come down the aisle and almost run into me and look at
Mm.
me like a ghost. And then they said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were there. I didn't see you."
Wow.
Different people said the same sentence to me and they were shocked because I was in the middle of the aisle, not moving. They were moving towards me.
Yeah.
So they couldn't even like pick up on my energy because it was so low.
Wow.
Like I was just a ghost or something. And they looked at me like a ghost. And I went home
Mm.
and I bawled my eyes out because was figuring out that like, oh, I'm not even picking up as a person, not registering as a person
Mm.
in the world because I'm like so, you know, and I've
Mm.
heard that can happen actually when you work really hard to achieve something for years and you get it, you get the thing that
Right.
you've been working to achieve. And
Right.
it's like, wait, where's the big, you know,
Right.
and I
Right.
felt for years that, this is the formula for my happiness. It was
Mm.
attributed to an external factor that I would become a successful artist. I would, get into these galleries that I've wanted to get into.
Right.
And that started happening, and I was still like, wait, there was no sense of connection
Right.
for me as what was missing, my sense of community. So anyways, I was
Mm.
bawling my eyes out and I hear kind of my own voice, but not like it was kind of like my higher power, I guess is how you
Yeah.
would say it.
Yeah.
But it is as a thought in the form of my own voice. And kind of like, oddly enough, kind of like an Eat, Pray, Love. The same dynamic was funny.
Yeah.
But that voice had said to me, my own comforting higher self, it said, when you breathe, it's me loving you. When you walk, it's me loving you. When you eat, it's me loving you. And it just kind of trailed off as if to say or to show me that this whole thing, this
No.
whole experience of being in this universe is for the perception and expression of love. That everything that is seemingly mundane is not, that everything is for the experience of love.
Yeah. Wow.
Um,
That's an
yeah.
incredible. That's a real aha moment, epiphany, connection with your, in some circles would refer to it as the holy guardian angel. It just kind of looking out for you, interestingly enough, lets you go into your descent.
Yeah.
And then in that moment where you can really hear it. And so then what happened from there?
I realized that if I did commit suicide, like my biological father did commit suicide when I was a little girl, that
Mm.
um, it would be like being taken out of school at the fourth grade. That if were I to incarnate again, I would have to go right marching back to fourth grade. That it doesn't like
Yeah.
your lessons don't stop. You have to just do all that work of
Yeah.
coming back in, to transform it.
Mm.
And
So you got that insight too, that like
yeah, yeah. And
you don't get away.
yeah. That basically that suicide isn't an escape hatch,
Mm.
as it were. It's a restart button.
Yeah.
And I have these little dots, and you can see them. But I got this. I tattooed this on my hand, and it's a Beethoven love letter excerpt at the end of one of his love letters,
Really?
and it's Braille. Yeah. And it says, "Ever thine, ever mine, ever ours." And this came about, or this came out because of this spiritual crisis experience where, after I had this incredible shift, I wanted to write a love letter to the very best aspects of humanity, but kind of realized that,
Mm.
that part that is compassionate and merciful and like authentic and
Yeah.
radically, full of genius. And I wanted to like write a love letter, like a poem or something, and realized it wouldn't mean anything. It would just be nice words, and that what would mean something is for me to become the love letter.
Mm.
And so I got this as kind of like a reminder to keep on that path of like being a student of compassion, to be
Mm.
constantly like, what is the most compassionate action I can do for myself and for the times that I find myself in right now.
Mm.
And it's not to say that that's not at times debilitating, particularly this year with everything happening in Gaza,
Yeah.
in Palestine. It's been really fucking sorry, but it's been really hard, staying aware of like, the dynamics of compassion, and what a friend of mine has spoken to me about and taught me about, at least in the Buddhist lineage of, you know
Mm-hmm.
learning about this, is that there's far-sighted enemy of compassion, which is malice. That's the enemy of compassion you see coming, but the nearsighted enemy is like grief. The nearsighted enemy of compassion is grief. So like if a person is drowning in the river next to you and you just leap into the river and start drowning too, that's
Mm-hmm.
grief. Instead of like,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And some people might say, oh, that's spiritual bypassing, and that's just not wanting to go into grief. But I think that no, it is important, sure, to experience and validate your grief, but to not stay there. To not stay there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing to be authentically expressing and feeling the emotions that are coming up, but you don't necessarily build a business plan or a life plan or even I'm going to save the world plan based solely on that emotional experience. Um, there's got to be more to it because it feels a little bit like you're just always going to be tilting at windmills your whole life.
Yeah.
Finding something to let your grief drive you towards saving in some way, and there's a way that it sounds good. Oh, I just love so much, I gotta, but then it's like, well, when you're just using your own unprocessed grief to, I don't know, distract away from it, or because um I think on the Gaza for me recently, I haven't looked away. I've been I feel like I've experienced a lot of grief over the years. So all this stuff happening in the Middle East, the whole the there were several, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, when the I think the Lebanese, what it was, but there was a lot of traffic going across the Mediterranean in boats. And there was an image of a young 3-year-old boy just washed up on the sand.
I remember that.
And it was emblematic. It even to me, it's emblematic of what we're going through in Gaza right now. It's the discarded nature, the ability for people to actually bypass, pretend those things aren't happening. And we're having a lot of that in the US, and we're having a lot of that within, you and I are tracking many of the same intersectional feminist voices
Mhm.
that are just ripping to shreds the previous story around feminism that actually had a lot of white superiority dynamics built into it. And we can definitely go into that, because I feel that, in my, I'd say about 25 years in this consciousness space, like working to support people who are bringing products forward into the space, the women lead. Like there's men in there, and they tend to be interested in shamanism and UFOs and aliens and stuff. But when we're talking about like where where the most people are driving the consciousness studies and participation in transformational workshops and things like that, it has been women, absolutely. And it's also become a bastion of privilege and celebrity culture. And that's why I sometimes often call the space that has been my career for a long time the transformational or consciousness industrial complex, is because there is this dollar driven dynamic that influences how one feels about one issue over another. And even this concept of, it's a very true concept for me, of the 10,000-foot soul level view. Like it's all beautiful, it's all good, it's all, there's, we all die, and we if you're the slave this lifetime, you'll be the slave holder in the next one, and yada yada yada. And I always find that that's like the low hanging fruit perspective for people of privilege to reach towards, is this kind of like, oh, it's all next lifetime, I'll probably be the Gazan who's being starved to death, that it all balances out. And I really think there's space, they've taken a really deep truth and then they've essentially twisted it to bypass the whole experience. And I think that some of
Yeah.
these voices, like this, I think Sarah of Magdalene probably comes to mind the most in terms of someone who's like previously on the goddess retreat, white feminist spiritual leader perspective, and then did a 180 and was just like, just like, has called the empress is wearing no clothes on herself, and then now is just like fucking got the crosshairs out for every feminist that won't acknowledge the tragedies and horror that are going on in Gaza. What's your take on that? On all of that? Like, just,
Oh,
we're trying to save a whole planet, and I don't know. Are we trying to save it? What's going on? What are we doing here?
when it comes to the language of saving the
Yeah,
planet,
yeah,
save the planet, I'm as far from removed from that, like,
right, right.
because it's the language and the word be is a trap in a way, because
Mm-hmm.
we are so much part of the planet. We are,
Right.
the way that I interpret it is that we are in the process of learning how to exit the Anthropocene and walk into the Symbiocene. We're learning how to be into symbiotic relationship. So
Yeah,
the act of saving is actually integration,
yeah,
the integration of ourselves back into ecology, back into being in, as Lila June might say, being a keystone species,
yeah, yeah,
being
yeah,
back
yeah.
in receivership, really, to
Mm,
being in receivership of our station of care, of re-entering into our contract between creator and the planet
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
ones to care for her. And
Yeah.
I really do believe that when it comes to land and land stewardship, it should always be from a point of stewardship rather than ownership. It's not to
Mm-hmm.
say there can't be boundaries of care with regards to ourselves and to others and to the
Mm-hmm.
planet and to the beings that we share this world with, these ecologies with, but that the function of ecology and the functions of the rights of the living world, the rights of nature as it's been deemed, that it is in that creation of sufficiency, the creation of care and the embeddedness of care into that function, so that just like animals migrate, humans can migrate,
Mm-hmm.
versus this like penalizing, violent responses and protocols for the crossings of borders, or the attempts, I should say, the attempts of the
Mm-hmm.
crossing of borders. But that if land is a right, that the land belongs to itself, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how is our stewardship of that land
Yeah.
conducted first from a place of compassion
Yeah.
and sober like integrity with the land itself? I'm really looking forward to like how that becomes real and not some static intellectual idea, but is like affects the very like
Yeah.
very way that there's no trash, there's no everything,
Right.
that we know and are surrounded by and are in, and changes that and the dismantling of empires where they stand.
Yeah, well, the progression, as I understand it, in terms of making that kind of change, I heard articulated by Peter Joseph one time, who was the founder of the Zeitgeist movement, did the Zeitgeist films, and he had the Zeitgeist movement, and the plan, the way he laid it out in one of his talks, was first we raise awareness, then we gain critical mass, and then with critical mass, you can take meaningful action. And there is this. Uh, Sometimes there's all you can do is talk and educate and raise awareness, because people won't change until they're doing it from within. and and to the listener, to the viewer, see what Amber did a few minutes ago. She like dropped in a couple of like key terms, the moving from the concept of saving to stewardship, and there's something you said about moving out of the Anthropocene into the. Repeat
Symbiosis.
that again. There was some very.
Moving
It
out of
felt
the Anthropocene and moving
so.
into the Symbiocene.
One more time, please. Just.
Moving out of and exiting the Anthropocene and entering the Symbiocene.
Mm-hmm.
That I think you can, if anybody's interested in going into the rabbit hole of that, there's a really great author, Glenn A. Albrecht, that
Okay.
breaks that down. There's also other names for the Symbiocene. I also see it as really indigenous forms and lenses of
Mm-hmm.
care, because, but at least
Yeah.
with my own interests in all of this, the indigenous living cultures, they are embedded within their ecologies to the same sense that like
Right.
the settler functions of the university and the hospital and the marketplace and the church, all that is embedded within ecology.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no decisions or outcomes or measures of gain, like the word profit. Its etymology means a measure of gain or benefit.
Right.
There's no such thing as a profit which jeopardizes the ecology. Doesn't
Right.
exist.
Right.
And I
Right.
really do feel that that is like a design baseline, but it
Mm-hmm.
must be nested within conciliation and reconciliation. It must be nested
Right.
within the dismantling of empire where it stands,
Right.
whether
Right.
the US or other countries, you know what I mean? It goes by different names, but these massive, massive powers. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I want to dive more into that, because part of what I want to have our conversations be is yeah, we got to hit the aspirational points, paint beautiful poetic pictures of idealized long-term visions. But just like there was this these the concept of transition towns several years ago. I don't know if they're still around, that particular organization, but it's all in the transition plan. It's all in what happens between here in this current dog eat dog dynamic, dominator model of consciousness, and then this idealized long-term vision of, reciprocity and people who are emotionally aware and emotionally aware of others, and negotiating conflicts in healthy ways. And what have you encountered that actually gets into the details of like, okay, here's the schematics of how we move through this?
Hmm. I almost am like, no.
No,
Because
so it's not schematics, it's basically backing away from schematics and just being and letting something unfold naturally.
it's not that it's what I kind of like bristle at is the notion of having an answer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much
Sure,
like
sure.
like what inspires me to participate in the field and the environments and the co-creativity and collaboration by which plural answers occur, by
Mm-hmm.
which mycelial insights and um, actions and behaviors which affirm life and nurture and midwife the beginning of these changes that we're so seeking, but from the inside out.
Right. So
Yeah.
you had to, so this idea of moving into the symbiocene, which is really, you said, a more of an indigenous approach to living and being. What came up for me in that moment was I've often felt like a lot of my resistance to fitting into, because obviously I'm very white passing. Right. I could have made this life a lot easier for myself, really leaning into that. But I've found that, like, my skin and my gender aside, I feel like I have an indigenous heart that just resists being that person who is a colonizer, from it just has a colonizer dynamic. Now, I'm sure someone could just pick apart and identify all of my white privilege. And that's not something, I'm not saying I don't have that. I'm saying I have experienced resistance to being what I would really have to be if I wanted to fully cash in my white privilege card. And I attribute that to decolonizing my heart and not wanting to participate in that. And but that felt, I don't know that I was guided. I felt like I was just stuck with this heart in this space, and I've just been struggling with it. That I don't know. That's just what came up. And I
Mhm.
don't know if there's a question in that as much as, do more people need to just arrive at that naturally, or is there a way that you've encountered or that you've heard of or that people are doing, or is it just events like this? So it's just where people have to, they can't look away from what whiteness has done to the world in terms of a, when I say whiteness, it's, colonizer dynamics, dominator dynamics. And it hasn't always been just white people. They're just the ones that have been doing it recently.
Right, I get what you're saying. It's so interesting. There's a film about this coming out by Ava DuVernay called
Mm,
Origins or Origin. It's coming out the night. I think it just came out actually. 19th was today, the 20th.
mhm.
Yeah. And I can't wait to see it. And it's all
Oh,
about like,
origins.
yeah, Origin or Origins. It's all about that common thread. It's based on a book called Caste like a caste system,
Mhm.
and like what are the threads of that dominator. But I really feel, going back to what you're saying about decolonizing your heart, like we're all on kind of a different spectrum based, I guess, supposing on our I suppose on our privileges and how we show up and how we do that. um, Decolonization looks very differently from one person to the next, and I have met really beautiful people of every denomination and levels of privilege, And I find that those that are standing in the most privilege um, are they are very like kind of like kind of like walking around with a parking brake on
Right.
most of the time, and just very very sensitive to like not wanting to be complicit in harm, but
Yeah.
it basically creates so much self-reflection that it can be debilitating.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
really just
Absolutely.
from a place of being humble and being in the space of learning and tenderness and showing up where you can and amplifying the tenderness aspect as well as the unlearning more than like the walking around with the parking brake on kind of
Yeah.
eggshell. It's
Yeah. I can definitely own where it's felt a lot at times like a parking brake. I also think those moments, and even I would even say for the last few years, there's been a lot of that dynamic, and it's coincided with just my own personal healing journey that had to do with childhood stuff, abandonment and feeling less than, and there's sort of a intersectional space that I can touch where it's like I go, oh, with these folks that are talking about from this culture and this culture and this culture, you know, I'm not going to name them, but I identify with those. I feel closer to them than I feel to these people that I look more like, but I don't want to be around. I don't want to be like them. I don't like what they do with their power. I like, so there's a kind of like shying away from being in the world to a certain extent, no matter where you go on the world's terms, which let's, you know, white people didn't invent domination, because we see it everywhere. But there's this sort of shifting dynamic that we're going to from this Anthropocene into the Symbiocene. What's Anthropocene?
Anthropocene is defined as the age, um, like an epoch in
Mm-hmm.
which the footprint of humans determines the outcomes of the age or the conditions of the age, and it's not in a good way. It's like it's in
Got
a
it.
negatively impacted sense. Like I'm trying to think of what the previous epoch or age is, but they like the Holocene, I think, is one of them. But
Mm.
the Anthropocene is floating around as one of these ideas right now, like, oh, we're in the Anthropocene.
Yeah, yeah, I get it.
Like people are
Yeah,
pulling it up, like, oh, this is a great insight, and without like really thinking about like, okay, well, what are we going to do about it?
yeah,
Kind of thing. How do we like? I'm so passionate about like how do we think about these meta problems, but at the feasible local level where we have the capacity to show up and nourish each other and hold
mhm,
space for that nourishment, for our bodies, our minds, our hearts, and at the same time come up with solutions for things like bioremediating plastics out of our watersheds at the
right.
local level. Like those are things that need to be in happening, but at the small level there's like a hybridization between these like huge scary global problems, but in a capacity that can be handled at like the
Yeah,
small beautiful kind of functioning mean.
yeah. When you push back a little bit on the concept of saving the world, in actuality, I very much agree with you. There's this sense of the Earth kind of all doing it to herself. She made us, and we're causing all sorts of problems. And who started that? Who was it that injected that hormonal dynamic into our brains that are going to make us be a certain way? And when we change our minds, it's probably going to be another kind of like Gaian level hormonal impulse. It's like, all right, we need symbiosis now. Like we needed expansion, we needed this whatever, because I'm going through my own process of evolution. I'm going through my own blossoming and coming into the next level of being, and apparently that requires a lot of humans to do it. And but And I wasn't pushing on you for an answer per se, as much as more of like a field report, like what have you heard? Because there's this, what my approach that I've taken with this creating shifts conversation very much follows that. Like, all, you can't make a plant grow, you can just create the soil conditions for a plant to grow and thrive naturally. And what I'm trying to do here is explain and support and open up dialogue around, I can't tell a really creative artist, engineer, scientist what they should do, what they should invent, what they should write, what they should paint. I can only say, listen, there's a set of best practices, best, that if you do these things, if you engage in these mystical practices, if you, from whatever culture feels right for you, you will open up more to what already wants to come through and be an even more available vehicle to that inspired direction. And that feels similar to what you're saying. Like, you're like, you can't overly, you can't, somebody's going to design the schematics for the thing that does the thing that does the thing. Like, that's got to happen. But altogether, what everyone's got to be doing is relaxing and opening up and understanding that they have to get the answers from within. And we give them the tools to distinguish, like, well, sometimes the inner voices are the things that, part of your body that just wants stuff because it wants stuff. So how do you distinguish from the different voices? You can get into the nitty gritty of what's your higher self's voice and what's your ego's voice when you're trying to get your needs or your wants met. I find that there's a lot of, particularly in the conversation around manifesting, like, you can go get the thing, you can go be the person, you can go do the start that business. But I don't hear as much of like, well, when you say I want or I need, which I is asking that?
Yeah.
Like, that feels counterproductive to signing up people for the workshop if you start putting roadblocks in their way. And then that's where I think transformational work uh, goes from this sort of like authentic expression of the spiritual life that's going to take us, like a boat onto the distant shore that's beautiful and waiting for us, and all these metaphors, to, oh, we're just gonna divert you back into the capitalistic mindset of acquire and try to meet all these, try to fill that hole with externals. And we're giving them, and I also don't, and we're also being disingenuous with these things, because if you're not at a certain level of energetic consciousness, none of that stuff's going to work anyways. So there's a part of me that deals with more than just a little frustration when I see people really taking the capitalistic mindset and just launching spiritual products or transformational products when they themselves really are um, still caught up in the sewage. And sometimes explaining sewage like privilege, or no, let's just call it privilege. It's like explaining water to a fish. Like, you're just so in it, you're so dependent on it. It's so part of your protocol that, like, there is no not that. And maybe that's why you just have to have it. Just people don't just change on their own. It happens when, maybe it's going to take another 100 days plus 75 years, even more casualties, for people to start thinking, maybe there is something, maybe they are being a little too hard on the Palestinians, and I just don't know how to, I just don't know how to relate to that. Um, and that's where I need to kind of do my own work around forgiveness and release and not knowing all the answers yet.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this kind of thing, like about spiritual tools and all of that. And he's really cool. His name's Larry. He
Hey,
runs
Larry.
a he runs a gallery called Wit Gallery here in
Shout
Columbus.
out to
And
Larry and Wit Gallery.
yes. And he was having a conversation with me about, when it comes to manifestation and tools, and people are sharing these things, and if it's not able to be a tool that benefits, let's say, a child that is enslaved to make our cell phones, like the tungsten or the cobalt in our cell phones, that we're able to have this conversation with it. If it's not able to help them, is the tool worth anything? And then, like, it's even getting into the conversation here, like how are we going to use our skills, our tools available to us, to disintegrate that level of duress in the world that's happening on our dime.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's like, man, like, it gets back into catch 22 kind of thing. Like I actually would be perfectly happy not actually having a lot of the technology that I do have, and living a simpler existence, being able to rest at night knowing that I am in no way complicit or funding, like, or passively or directly having to do with, like, the suffering happening in the world. And to me, that just figuring that out alone is more meaningful than trying to find, like, the next affirmation or, like, I don't know, like the next kind of tool or kind of thing that feels like it would be good for my spiritual practice. Because I've met people who, like, they raise, like, kids in a very simple existence, and they just live, like, kind of a simple life, and, like, they're, like, I don't know, like, there's certain individuals where they give off this vibe that they have been through some things, like they've been edified, kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily, like, because of their practice in this regard, or like putting their spirituality kind of, like, up here as something to be constantly engaged in. It's like the way that they live their lives is enough with
Yeah.
regards to that. It's enough in terms of their ability to be grounded in a sacred way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the emergence of technology, I guess tools over the millennia, almost feels like out of our control. Like it almost, like there's an aspect, and this might be a little bit of a rationalizing story, and that maybe it is better if it all just goes away, and if it becomes too much of a problem, it will all go away. But it was in the 80s, a Cambridge trained scientist and philosopher by the name of Peter Russell. He had a book called The Global Brain Awakens, and then he also just had like a half-hour video. It's out on the internet for free, out on YouTube for free, called The Global Brain. And in this thing, he goes through. It's only a half hour. It's an interesting presentation. He talks about how in the development of a fetus, the particularly in the, the brain development, uh, that a lot of the focus during the first part of the brain developing is on just populating with brain cells, more and more brain cells, more and more brain cells. And then he says in his British accent, he's like, imagine that you are one of these brain cells. What would you think towards the end? Like, oh no, we're not gonna have enough oxygen. We're gonna be overgrazing, and there's not gonna be enough blood, and all of that. And then and we're gonna run out. It's all gonna be over. We're all gonna die. Then all of a sudden, at a key moment, uh, this the cell population uh, reduces and stabilizes, and then all the energy goes into building the synaptic interconnectivity dynamics between all of them. And then again, this is in the 80s, and he says, look at our communication networks and all of this. We are spanning the globe. This is even further along. I mean, we are literally we're doing this conversation. We could have a whole bunch of people here from different languages, active with some sort of AI, Google Translate happening, and there's something about that. And I have to wonder about the intention that's transpersonal here. It's just using us to create itself at a whole other level that's Gaia. And we're just a part of it. We're like the pollen that maybe floats off of Gaia at some point, or we're we're part of a neural structure that starts becoming more obvious in future centuries as we become, as you say, more symbiotically attuned, and potentially even handling all of these scarcity abundance dynamics quite easily with all of our technologies in ways that we never could before. And that we're in just this very crunchy transitional space that is filled with horror, but kind of has always been filled with horror to a certain extent. I mean, the first awareness of the Buddha was all life is sorrowful. And then the commitment of the bodhisattva is, yes, all life is sorrowful. I shall joyfully participate in the sorrows of the world until all beings are illuminated. And I think that speaks to the compassion dynamic. Like, I'm not going to check out. I'm going to engage. I'm going to develop insights around these, what it means to be alive here, that understands that I have to say yes to it all. And then Joseph Campbell told us stories like, oh, you have to hold 2 points, like the one of the enlightened avatar that sees the whole creation as something magnificent, even with all of its horror. And then he used an Irish expression to kind of illustrate the nature of the bodhisattva dynamic. And it's the old Irish saying, is this a private fight or can anyone join in? It's like, so when you hold both of those, you can say yes to it all, but you don't get to let that perspective keep you from engaging and turning away and spiritual bypassing and just saying, like, what's a Sarah of Magdalene on Instagram? She's really blasts the concept of self-care, not self-care as like as something that's good to do, like, because yes, you got to take care of yourself, but say self-care as an escape pod from facing the horrors of Gaza, uh, and all the implications of what it means if you were speaking out against Gaza in terms of, well, how is that going to disadvantage me in my career, in my life, if I upset people by speaking out against Gaza? Certain people who do equate attacks on or critiques of Zionism with critiques of being Jewish. Like, there's a lot of that conflation of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, which it's not. There are just probably more Jewish people in the Jewish diaspora around the world that are against what's happening under the Zionist agenda. And I certainly for myself would never want my concerns and my issues with the war crimes that Israel is committing to be confused with how I feel about the Jewish culture and everything that it's brought to me spiritually, transformationally. I'm a student of Kabbalah, which is heavily based in Jewish mysticism. I have worked for, like, I don't know that I've ever had a Palestinian coworker, but many, if I would say most, if not most, but I'd say many of my coworkers have been Jewish, and it's 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 a it's a tension that I think we have to be able to separate that Zionist conversation from what just becomes another form of an ism, and I don't know whether you've even like had that struggle or that kind of pushback or anything like that, but I do think that a lot of people that are of Jewish descent are probably struggling even more with that
Yeah.
dynamic.
I've actually, I know somebody, I'm friends with someone who is Israeli
Mm-hmm.
and is living here. And they were saying that even before October, that there were something like 6 million people protesting the administration, particularly Netanyahu,
Mm-hmm.
before, like in the midst of all of this stuff.
Right.
And there's only 9 million people in the country.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's specifically in the Israeli occupied part of the country. It's a whole, and there's for me, there's the complexity. I'm able to hold the complexity of the what you're describing with the Zionism does not be like being anti-Zionist is does not make you anti-Semitic. And in fact, there are tons of Jewish people who are like, yeah, I am a contradiction because of this, according to new
Mm-hmm.
laws being in the US, trying to shut people down for advocating against genocide. But at the
Wow.
same time, I'm wanting to hold more complexity for like, why aren't we talking also about like getting to the very heart of empire, getting to like the very like someone, let me put it this way, someone said that some of the materials used to make the bombs that are going into Gaza also contain what's being mined in the Congo.
Right.
And so there's like that's when we get into the conversation of the complexity of holding complexity for dismantling empire. And that really it's extending because it's extending to other regions, whether we're talking about Tigray or French imperialism in Burkina Faso and Facebook and its impact in Myanmar.
Yeah.
Like it's really not
Yeah.
good. And there's like this burning wish within me or desire to want to like, okay, how can we impact these things through human agency, to outmodel wealth polarity, to outmodel these oppressive practices.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see spontaneous human agency about cleaning up the messes in Nigeria over the last 10 years. There have been like literally 10,000 oil spills between Shell and BP. Yeah, 10 years, 10,000 oil spills. That's 1,000 oil spills a year. Yeah. And now they're sort of, some of the major oil conglomerates are kind of pulling out of Nigeria and being like, well, we can sell it. We'll sell it to you, and it's an ecological atrocity. And for how much barrels of oil have been pumped out of there. And I feel like, sure, someone might be like, oh, well, what do you drive a, insert car model here. What are you going to do about your energy? And I get that. I understand that. We need to,
Mm-hmm.
as Fullerton would say, we need to figure out how to switch out the engines of a plane mid-air.
Yeah.
And then how do we like change these systems as they're functioning to and some people will be disrupting their function, and some people will be seeding down and midwifing the new functions that will
Mm.
be dismantling that harm as it's occurring, and our participation or complicity, whether passive or direct. And yeah, I keep coming back to this balancing act between the tenderness and its passion. And it's really like there needs to be this kind of discernment between the not wanting to think that it's outside of us, that it's through a technological advancement, because we have the tools now at our disposal. It's really a case of like the reemergence and the balance of the feminine in seats of power, and the distinction between what is real power, and what is force.
Yeah.
Because there's a conflict, there's a confusion between the two. I think that compassion and action, and the creation of sufficiency and diverse wealth with the out modeling of wealth polarity,
yeah,
is the balancing between the masculine and the feminine in the seats of power, to out model and to really disintegrate assertions of force that are like brutal in the world. And
yeah, and coming from a perspective that's taking the leaders have to be representative of the whole planet. Like that's like there is, I am not a one world government proponent or a centralized power proponent.
Same.
But I also know that you cannot have what we're like we have been progressively going from tribes to villages to towns to small cities to large cities to principalities to groups of principalities into nations into multi-nation states into and it doesn't go backwards unless we reduce our capacity in some way. We've taken a hit. It seems to keep going towards more unification, more unification, more unification. It seems inevitable for us to have a global community without our, and they may not be institutions like the previous institutions, which are very much centralized power, top-down hierarchical control, all of that. But it's going to have to be global. These institutions will have to be holocratic and global. And that's something that just feels inevitable unless we become this psychic hive, like which I don't think we're quite there yet, unless you count mobile technologies and things like that. Then we're talking about it's a technology supported hive dynamic. And this is where I think some of our conversations around Buckminster Fuller and I, to a certain extent, I think Jacques Fresco was in Buckminster Fuller's league, and others I don't. I think he kind of he was very idiosyncratically oriented to his very unique vision, and he was pretty really anchored to it. He was very progressive, Jacques Fresco was, and also very like, I don't know, a one-man show in some interesting ways. Like it was but he produced a number of really incredible drawings and designs that I think really progressed that conversation. But Buckminster Fuller, he had another layer of language underneath all of this and a way of thinking that I think really makes him one of he wasn't the only one, but he was like an icon of every man and woman scientist out there that is essentially trying to work with science and engineering principles to intelligently manage the Earth's resources and support more people on less, and I don't know, it's and you were part of the Fuller Institute's program back, was that 5 years ago now? Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Yeah.
I know you don't want to be the one who has answers per se, but I think you can represent Buckminster Fuller's vision of what it could look like if you do have schematics and a step-by-step plan to transitioning to these long-term idealized smart cities, or permaculture wonderlands, and things like that.
Yeah, Bucky's great. I was part of the design science studio from 2020 to 2021,
Mm-hmm.
and that really helped me to integrate what my project for the regenerative footprint into my artwork in the form of free uh, free license footage into poetry. So I was making these cinematic poems or cinepoems, and they were like pieces that were really about grounding in that work and making a bridge between the artistic expression of it and what I was knowing and cognizing is possible in terms of evolutions of culture. Bucky is incredible. I first heard about him in my mid 20s, I think, and got into him briefly, but not as deeply as later on in my 30s. He's incredible. He is the inventor of so many things. He would be able to go on to these huge like lectures that would be like 8 hours long if you were to let him keep going.
Yeah.
And he's most noted for the geodesic dome. Prior to the geodesic dome, he'd invented like a house that was really weatherproof, but the investors at the time were not willing to also invest in the maintenance for these homes. There was going to be like 50,000 of them or something. It was a huge contract.
Wow.
And the investors weren't willing to also put up the needed extra capital for maintaining any of these homes. And Bucky was like, well, we can't do this to people and just leave them out standing to dry. And he walked away from the project, and it really affected his legitimacy, let's say, in some scientific communities. And he went into teaching. I don't know if he's also credited with tensegrity, but I really love this idea of integrity, which is like the tension and integrity of a structure. So like the geodesic dome.
That was his term, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is. Like with the geodesic dome, it's basically it's blades and chalices and a half sphere all intersecting, if you think about it. Right. Which is really beautiful. It feels like that is a schematic for the balancing of masculine and feminine. But yeah, so basically if a storm were to come and to affect a house, it would, let's say a branch or a tree or whatever fell onto part of that dome, it would mostly impact only where it hit, and like in that area. But because the weight is evenly distributed between the entire structure, it is able to withhold and uphold, I should say, its integrity because of its integrity, because of the way that the weight is distributed throughout its structure.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I think that that's the way we need to be thinking about our communities. Like we need to be thinking about, okay, how are we setting up the flows of equity, the flows of basically creating sufficiency in the world that is like taking care of these, the biome, our local biome, watershed, and flora and fauna, but with the global in mind. I would love to see something where people are creating that sort of innovations and things that are happening at the local scale, or maybe trade happening, but the trade is dependent on the support of a culture. Like it's more nuanced. It's not like, so you can buy a little doodad. Like there needs to be like a sieve for trade. So it's
exactly.
Yeah, protecting a culture, also protecting their expression.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a because there's the people that you actually are around, the 175 to 200 people that might be in your sphere of experience. And then there's this several billion that are spread across the planet, all who deserve life and breath as well. So creating models and approaches that honor both, that take into and it's really a stewardship. It's like your permaculture approach to stewarding humanity and stewarding the planet at the same time. And right now it's managed more like a ranch, where humans are one of the ranch animals that are being farmed and developed, um, mostly for labor,
Yeah.
for various industrial goals of nations that are run by small groups of people. But when you're talking about what are the skills required at that level of leadership in today's world, it looks more like ranch managers in a lot of ways, and very industrialized approach. I mean, just think of it, what's a social security number, it's like your little stamp, the little
Uh,
tag that got like tagged
yeah,
on your ear when you were
right.
born, and you're you got a number. um i'm I'm part of uh, like a conscious partnership, uh, consultancy company called the Joyful Alchemists, with the other primary consultant is a gentleman named John Schindler. And some of our projects in that right now, it's more of an incubator for a few different projects we're developing. And one is called Awakening, or Activating the Crew of Spaceship Earth, which is a real nod to Buckminster. I mean, John, when he came up with this concept for in his own life path, he hadn't done a lot of this kind of research and didn't know necessarily that, like, Buckminster Fuller or Marshall McLuhan had already been working with this metaphor. That was something that he learned more about when he and I started talking, but the concept is still what it is. So there's that, but then there's this, and that's more of a philosophical awakening, just kind of like the conversation we're having right here in a book form, intended to activate people who are going to be the creative stewards of this spaceship Earth. And another one that we're doing is called ARC, Anthro Regenerative Communities. And it's essentially taking what you and I are talking about, and in the spirit of transition, the consultancy offers a path from getting from the dream to reality through a balance of this, not only having a strong philosophical grounding in why we need communities and why people need to live in community dynamics, but also draws on project management backgrounds and commercial real estate development background, which is like, you honestly cannot make some of these dreams reality until you've got you're plugged into the systemic dynamics that deal with things like land ownership and land development and things like that. So, there's these, and this is a piece I think you and I have discussed a lot, and where I feel really aligned in terms of, you've mentioned community several times now. And we have towns, we have cities. Ojai could be considered a community, but it's a civic agreement. It's not necessarily a socio interdependent and inter-emotional dynamic. Like, everyone can just go in their doors and close a thing, pay your taxes, pay your utilities, plug in your internet, and never interact with anyone around you. Whereas the other approach is, you're in much more connection with the people around you. You have, and when you do that, you have greater opportunities for boundary violations, conflicts, things like that. So the other piece that has always felt really important to me while we are detailing all the benefits of living in community, like shared child rearing dynamics and group purchasing and just feeling more touch and being seen and liked and desired and admired and desired, I mean, like, we want you here, I mean, other types of desire too, that gets into more of like the flow of eros in a community. But all that proximity requires tools, and it requires more than legal tools. Like right now, you don't do things because you'll be fined, because you'll be put in jail. Not necessarily because you feel within yourself what that other person would feel like if you did that. Like there's no, so there's all these elements that have to be worked into the raising awareness dynamic. And that is, I think, where I think the soil building conversation also comes in, because you cannot mandate, you cannot legislate a compassionate society. Compassionate societies are the natural byproduct of compassionate citizens. So the approach is raise awareness at the citizen level, not only in terms of conflict management, but emotional intelligence and how to track your own triggers, and the concept of compassionate communication. These are just things that we just don't learn. We're not taught that in mass,
Mhm.
and it's almost like they don't want us to. Look at the way our popular news, either our popular news channels are just saying, hey, we're on a business model. You're already territorial and competitive. We're just meeting you where you're at, and we're raking in the dough. You could also say that they're doing it intentionally. They're intentionally creating media options that just make people polarize.
Mhm.
Whichever is which, that's not going to get us to where we want to go as a global culture of cultures. Of just, it's not like I want a monoculture, but I think, yeah, have your culture. Be Jewish, be Palestinian, be Nigerian, be European, be all these things. Like, celebrate the different cultural art forms and things, but you're also living on a single planet. Like, these revolutions, in addition to us having the cell phones and the technology, these revolutions are being fought on these tech, like, how would you even have your awareness raised about any of these things if you weren't, you know, part of the global majority who also has a cell phone, who also has a mobile device, right? It feels so part of one thing that all I can do is I can't even think backwards. I can't, like, there's a part of me, it just feels like it's impractical, and it's not even really going to ever happen, that we're going to go backwards voluntarily into these agrarian societies and trad wives and, all these things that are just kind of like, they're fantasies, they're hobbies of people who have enough time to be worried about it. The future to me is that we all have all of it, and we figure out how to get it humanely and distribute it humanely, and that's a psychological war first. To me, psychological spiritual war first.
Hmm. I wouldn't say that. I would say the inverse. I think it's waging peace, actually. And I don't see it linearly, like
Mm-hmm.
that we would go back to an agrarian-based society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like thought is always evolving, and I find a lot of nourishment and insight from, um, the when people are interviewing, let's say, an elder in the middle of uh, very low contact with outsiders, an indigenous elder, let's say in Ecuador, and they're talking about, the state of the world, or someone interviewing the Kogi Mama. It's like in the
Mhm.
Golden Thread, they're describing, little brother, which is us,
Yeah.
living in a colonized lifestyle. Like this is a problem, and this is what we need to reverse. Um, and as far as the legislating, like you can't legislate for things, I don't know about that. I've,
Well, I mean, as a transitionary measure, but I mean, ultimately, real peace comes when people are voluntarily peaceful. They've been provided the tools and insights to access that inner peace. And maybe this means, oh, we're going to mandate emotional intelligence training in schools. Yeah, there's a certain amount of that, but ultimately, people have to understand why, right?
yeah, but when I say like not being able to legislate, like I feel like we would start to see a very different world if half of our representing members, for example, in the US alone, were female, and there were no more career politicians. Like let's say you could only
Right.
spend 3 years in office, and there's a cap to your income, there's a maximum wage. You can't receive
Yeah.
lobbying contributions to your campaign beyond a certain amount. Separation between corporation and state would
Yeah.
be a huge one. Empathy training, and then as well as like training, like you have to have a 10,000 hours in different positions, whether that's working fast food or childcare or elder care or working in a grocery store, but working 10,000 hours in different societal roles, in
Yeah.
roles that are supporting
Yeah.
a culture. Or I shouldn't.
Right. Right. No, you can definitely pass those laws and legislate. And in a democratic society, most of the people that are voting for those laws would be having to be doing it voluntarily, right? So you couldn't necessarily legislate like, oh, you have to like. It means people who are not understanding why this is important have to understand why it's important. I mean, that's and then they vote for leaders that do that. But before that, I think that in terms of the revolutionary dynamic, like it requires, I think, some version of a global strike. Like
Yeah.
it's just like and we have to understand that we're incentivizing the wrong people to lead us. And that what
Yes.
you're talking about is incentivizing the right people to lead us. But we have to have been educated enough in mass to even open up to that.
Yeah.
And what I
Yeah.
would love, to your point, is that no mayors, no presidents, no board of directors, like sure, advisors, whatever, but people who are actually in that kind of traditionally held by men role, if whoa, what the hell?
That was
Something
awesome.
from the universe. Say, yeah, we got balloons. Where did that come from?
Yay! That's
Yay. Must be a
celebration,
good idea.
Cherokee.
No, like there's no men presidents, there's no men CEOs. If we just made that law, that would be incredible. Doesn't mean you can't have male advisors, but I think women in power would treat the men under their power way better than it's ever been in with the reverse. Like why
Well,
not? I don't.
also,
I've worked for a lot. I've definitely appreciated certain aspects of women-owned companies way more than men-owned. I mean, there's just a quality to those companies that have always been better. Um, that's a law I would get behind. You know.
when I say women, I also mean femmes. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are plenty of women that have gotten to where they are by acting like men, and
Right.
by embodying a masculine, competitive, dog eat dog sort of. I shouldn't say that that is the quality of masculine, but that
Right.
is a quality or aspect of what what patriarchy is, even in its oppression of men, is that cutthroat sort of competitiveness, and that women have also been there. But I should say femmes, which is also to
Mm-hmm.
include queer and trans folks too.
Mm-hmm.
Really, it's the tenderest, it's the tenderness aspect that I would
Right.
love to see seats of.
Yeah. And that's a, to me, that I would trust my fate way more in those collective hands
Yeah.
than in the collective hands that have basically brought us to where we are now. And I would give that, if you're like, oh, you have to draw a line in the sand, ideally we wouldn't draw any lines like that. It'd be like the people of that, I don't know, you take away the profit motive, I think you got rid of most of your assholes, you know. Seriously. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah. That
you're
just,
not going to make any money by being in government. You're
yes,
not going to make any
get laid.
money.
You're not going to get a yacht.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. You're not even going to hang out with rich people. So you're not even going to like be able to be tempted like the folks on the on the Supreme Court that keep getting busted for I think Clarence Thomas is being is it Clarence Thomas?
I'm not sure. It
Yeah.
doesn't
So
surprise
anyway, I don't
me.
want to name names because I'll just sound ignorant, but I do know that you've got these folks that are on they're very very high positions of power, and all their friends, their social network, are all really wealthy people. So it's not like you don't get paid well for being in these positions, but you don't get two houses and you don't get a jet and you don't get these things, and all your friends have that. And so you start like, it's just corruptible.
Yeah.
And revising the tax code, I've been following and supporting Marianne Williamson for a long time, and some of the conversations that I'd had with her a long time ago were around how you language these improvements, and some of the more volatile language, for example, is wealth redistribution. Like that is the most triggering statement for many people, that many people are going to hear. But if you have a conversation about revising the tax code, you're essentially saying the same thing, but you're using more less less triggering language, more technically accurate language, and there's a time when that's more appropriate.
Hmm.
But six in one hand, half dozen in the other. You just kind of need to like share. You just need to share. You didn't make it on your own. You don't, being really clever and and really capable in certain ways doesn't actually mean you get to be the master of the universe. And that's the way we set it up right now. And I'm going to segue back to something we were talking about earlier around manifestation that was shared with me by, there's a teacher by the name of Damien Eccles, and he teaches Hermetic practices, and he had a really intense history of being basically imprisoned for murder when he was innocent. And he did 18 years on death row before he was released. And then he became a teacher for Sounds True. He did a few books with Sounds True on ritual and the Hermetic tradition. But he said, two things. That's why I'm thinking of it. One is the rich always win, which I reject.
Yeah.
And then he also said another thing specifically about manifestation. He's like, if you manifest, if all of your prayers and ceremonial work and meditations are orienting your manifestation energy towards spiritual sustenance, everything you want will take care of itself. Like, don't get Don't get hung up on wanting this and manifesting this and manifesting that, manifesting this, manifesting that. Unless real true desires come, like I'm going to bring some serious manifestation around this idea that I need to show up as a father for a teenage son in this next phase of our lives. So I need to change things around my financial situation and career dynamics. That's great to pull out manifestation for things that are practical. That's mostly what magic practice has been for in a lot of ways, when it isn't about essentially becoming a more pure vehicle for spirit. So yeah, just orient towards spiritual sustenance so that you can just be a good thing. But then there's this other thing I heard him say one time. He said the rich always win, so just don't even think about it. And I don't want to agree with that. I don't want to actually like say, oh, that's just the way it's always been and that's the way it's always going to be. I actually think that it's been a property. It's been an a kind of artifact of the scarcity reality that has been our evolutionary arc for the last, 3 to 5,000 years, probably a lot more. And I just don't think that there's a future for us where that dynamic persists, where the rich always win. They kill the Martin Luther Kings and the Kennedys and Malcolm X and what are your thoughts on that?
Um, well, I'm trying to catch the thought, because there's the peripheral one that's happening here in the here and now, and then there's the deep time one that relates back to taxation. Let me start at the taxation thing, and then I'll respond back up to this particular point.
Okay.
But basically, when I started getting into looking at like holistic economics and what basically the work that Charles Eisenstein and even Ewan have been looking at, like with sacred commerce, like we started out, the first bank was a threshing floor.
Right.
The first bank was a threshing floor, which is like where you take the wheat and you break it from the chaff and store the grain. The grain was the first bank. Societies, when they came together, which I wouldn't equate population with unity necessarily, more so around resiliency, I guess.
Okay.
But people would go from like a tribalistic to an agrarian to a city state. And when we get into the city state part of our evolution in time, with the grain states, cities or other regions would raid and pillage to steal the grain and cattle of other cities or other villages and things. Now, to prevent the pillaging, or as an option out of the pillaging, basically, some of these powerful city states or towns or villages or raiders essentially said, look, we won't come and pillage your town, just give us a cut of your grain.
Right.
And this was the first inception of a taxation in Western civilization, as you would know it.
Yeah.
It was really a supplementary act of war.
Right.
Taxation came out of war practices. And the reason this didn't impact so much of the nations on the African continent was because tubers would rot. Tubers, the Kosovo and the sort of many other Kosovo, but tubers wouldn't stay as long as the grains would stay. And so it was much, much, much later that this same sort of destructive, barbaric culture of raiding and that sort of thing didn't impact the African nations until like much later, and then it was labor.
Because you couldn't store up the surplus.
Yes, like the grain,
Yeah.
And so
And
Those,
accumulate more and more wealth and longevity potential for your tribe. Yeah.
yes, yes. And then it went into ingots,
Yeah.
the big, and then promissory notes that represented the ingots which were stored.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
huge clumps of metal that were very heavy, like
Yeah.
precious
Yeah.
metals to carry
That
around.
could be actually made into things that were probably weapons or tools, either
Yeah,
tools to kill or tools to build.
yeah.
Mm.
And the way that I've sort of seen the wealth aspect. Sorry, I'm a little choopy. This is Wheezy. This is all.
Hi.
She likes to be center attention sometimes. Um, but the way that I've noticed the building of wealth, or I guess wealth dynamics, it's kind of reminds me of, at least in this country, in the US, it kind of reminds me of like ropes in gym class when people are climbing up the ropes
Hmm.
to the floor, from the floor of the gymnasium to the ceiling of the gymnasium.
Yeah.
That at the bottom, just imagine it's spikes, but the
Right.
spike is houselessness.
Yeah.
The spikes is poverty at the bottom. And
Hmm.
so people constantly climbing up to the top will keep climbing and keep climbing to separate themselves as far away from death as
Right.
possible.
Yeah.
And that's the way that fear, in a way, is built into the economic system. And the way that it can be dismantled is
Mm.
by creating, basically phasing out wealth polarity and bringing in and out modeling this through a robust wealth diversity,
Hmm.
basically, where you have all sorts of wealth, but there is a maximum wage. I think it would be really a different world if people could recirculate or participate in a system in which $5 million a year is, that's what you make. Anything in
Yeah.
excess of that gets recirculated back to the very to the basis to create sufficiency for people who are experiencing food insecurity, or
Mm.
are grappling with a disability and that sort of thing, what taxes would normally go into. But I think pay it forward is a really great model, let's say, that isn't
Mm.
new. If you look at the Peruvian INI, that's an indigenous, like, economic model that's basically
Hmm.
like pay it forward, or is like pay it forward. There's much more nuance to it than that, but basically doing something for someone, knowing that you will be repaid in the future when you really need something.
Right. Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think had
Yeah. And that's based on the assumption, which has not been present in reality for a long time, that there's abundance. Like, to me, the scarcity model, like when I got into diving into this really deeply, it was somewhere between the 2000, between 2000 and then 2000, when the Zeitgeist movies were coming out, and they were having these conversations around how, the monetary system is based on reality, or is based on scarcity, and then they were attacking it like, but that's not real. And but I thought, yeah, but it has been. Like, scarcity, like, we've been held in check by our environment as humans, as animals, and scarcity has been a reality for a long time, even for the kings and the queens. Like, you like, would you want to be a normal person today or a king or a queen 200 years ago? I would take a normal person today's lifestyle, hands down, because of all the stuff that you would have to deal with. Like, you weren't, you know, there was just a lot that you couldn't get away from, no matter what your position on the social ladder was. Nowadays, because of all this technology and the ways that we can monitor resources throughout the whole world, we can monitor what everybody needs. I think scientifically, it's known, it's absolutely known that we can house and clothe and feed and have a high standard of living for every single person on this planet. But the consciousness of people, the consciousness of our institutions, haven't caught up to that reality. So there is an actual reality. The reality has changed. It used to be that scarcity was the reality. And now technologically and scientifically, scarcity doesn't have to be a reality, but we're just not there yet psychologically. And that's when I can kind of view all of these horrors and atrocities and evils through a kind of compassionate eye, because I know that everyone's insane. Everyone is still caught up in a kind of narrative around scarcity and getting ahead that is not true anymore, but has only just become not true, right? So this conversation is really about, and these conversations, I'm not speaking for your conversation or your side, but it's about saying, listen, things have changed. We can do things differently, and we have to do things differently. Um, and if you're laughing this off like, oh, human nature and this, people never change, like they will once the memo gets out. They
Yeah.
will once people actually, and particularly people in power, people with privilege, like you have to be a good steward. You know, you were given it with great privilege. Was that this is from a movie with Drew Barrymore. It was like a Cinderella movie called Ever After, and the big tagline was, "With great power comes great responsibility." That's what the prince had to learn as part of being a good king. You know, how to be a good
Oh,
king is, you know. So fuck, you know, if you're sitting on wealth, generational wealth, wealth that you created yourself, doesn't mean you're better. It means you've become empowered by life to be a steward of power. And what are you going to do with that? You know, and what's your soul lesson here? And are you going to be, you know, what are you going to do with that? And hopefully, you know, I'd love to see people really grasp on to their, not like you were saying, go around with a parking brake on, like own your whiteness, own your privilege, own, like face those things, but also like do something with it. Do something for other people with it. Do something for other people, knowing that that is actually a form of serving yourself, taking care of yourself. Don't build fucking bunkers off in the middle of nowhere. Face the fight. You know, be in the fight for what's real about the future and what's real about our possibility. I don't know.
yeah.
That's where I am with it.
And like, I know that you said that I mentioned community more than a few times, and to me, it's
Mhm.
not a buzzword. It's a dynamic. It's part of the necessary fractal of interbeingness. It's a necessary fractal of being, you know, like, and I think that where we traverse that land, that territory from the capitalistic wet dream of the silo, the individual as a silo, or
Mhm.
with the nuclear family, I guess, if you were to say it that way, just four people, whatever, 2.5
Right.
kids. Um, the way that we traverse that is by the creation or the interweaving of different kinds of energetic, the way that we show up energetically.
Mhm.
Some people have healing arts, some people play music, some people like cook, some people care for people, you know, childcare cooperatives.
Yeah.
But I think food is a wonderful ambassador for that. Food,
Mhm.
creating food sovereignty at the local level to
Yeah.
create sufficiency, um, is that one of those like initial bridge buildings towards that reality.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's I was just talking about this the other day. There's a really great urban, I don't want to say urban garden, but I guess it is an urban farm
Mhm.
out of um, Vancouver, and
Okay.
it's called Soul Food Farms or Soul Street Farms. I think it's Soul Food, but soul is spelled like the sole of your foot, SOLE.
Okay.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
for people who are grappling with traumas and addictions and are trying to get back into uh, a life for themselves,
Mhm.
it's not easy to hold down a job when you're grappling in and out of addiction.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this this organization, this urban farm, makes it possible for those people to have access to food and
Mm.
employment, in a way that doesn't
Well,
penalize them or police them, but creates that pathway for them instead.
right.
Um, and is that dynamic very much so of not handout but leg up kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I want to see more. I want to see stuff like that or programs like that of creating food sovereignty around creating sufficiency for
Hmm.
people who are experiencing that at the local
Yeah.
level,
Yeah.
like a flywheel. You know.
Yeah. And more of those. Like, I mean, you can have both. You can have a lot of big, expansive stuff happening, global stuff, but be local. What's it? Think global, act local, but beyond the catchphrase. Like
Yeah.
really be into your connection, into the connections with people, and it's just baby steps. Just you have to go run away and join a commune. You could start a garden first,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
and
And with
try.
the
You can choose to resolve conflicts by practicing compassion.
Mhm.
What
and
were
I
you
think
saying?
where it comes to compost, that the catchphrase of it, like where local meets global, composts is when multiple communities are beginning to do it and then
Mm,
sharing insights with each other. Like, in
yeah.
Japan, we found out that, when we have senior activities, if we have them next to the kindergarteners doing their activities, that it's like
Oh,
such a win-win, such an alchemy,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
you know, and then maybe that can spread as a practice into other communities. But
Right,
I think that's why I sort of shy away from like, oh, I have any ideas or like I have an answer. Like I
right.
really do feel like it will be through like an interoperability of people being able to express this is what we're doing, this is what's working, and then other
Hmm.
people seeing that with transparency and saying, oh my God,
Yeah,
let's try that or let's try doing that. Yeah.
yeah. And people are pretty traumatized. I mean, I think about like sometimes I think the community conversation could be so much further along, but then I think of cults. I think of small groups of people who are male dominated in their leadership structure, and you kind of like don't necessarily want people just getting too in their own vibe and without real awareness of other people from the outside, because just
Yeah.
there was a time, and I'm still very much in the conversation of how you release love from fear. And there are some conversations that look like that intersect in with the polyamory conversation and have even been available to that dynamic at times. And what I find though is that if you actually haven't worked through the shadows that come up by doing well in late stage capitalistic society, you're just going to bring all those power dynamics into that. And it's a kind of like there's you have to have both conversations at the same time, because I also think the way we structure marriage and relationships favors the narcissist and the controller. um I think that nuclear families can really isolate themselves. Um, but I also think that nuclear families can be really strong against ditzy community dynamics. Like if you can lose a family to a progressive lifestyle just as much as make a family stronger by opening up to um working on your own triggers so that you're less possessive and controlling in a relationship, but still want to preserve the the sacred container that's there. and really learned a lot about how, a good idea in the wrong hands just becomes disastrous. And also where a lot of people go into some of those lifestyle choices with disingenuous reasoning, and there's just so many, but then how do you actually form a really strong community if you haven't worked through attachment and jealousy dynamics, and you're just kind of always triggered by your partner being in close proximity to people that could be perceived as better or more desirable, and then there's such a and then there's no community forum to really put these fears or concerns out into a place where they're held compassionately and you're guided through. So I've just seen so much mental and emotional abuse
Yeah.
served out in the context of trying to be progressive and enlightened and moving to the next level.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Murphy's law in the interpersonal space.
Yeah. Well, I've practiced polyamory before. Having having done it before a couple of years ago, I don't know that it's worth the amount of work for me, personally speaking. I think I prefer monogamy just
Mhm.
because the amount of emotional labor that goes into communicating. There's kind of like a running joke in poly communities where it's like there's a family, career, like your love life, and then pick two or pick three, something like that. Like
Right, right.
it's really, really, really hard to like juggle all those things. And
Yeah.
then recently I was watching an interview with Alnor Lada, the guy that I was telling you about, Alnor Lada,
Okay, yeah.
from the rules. It's not the rules anymore. He's into something else now, like cultural hacking.
Hmm.
He's pretty cool. He's pretty interesting. He's got a community going in Costa Rica, and there he talks about omni-amory for
Yeah.
the reasons I think that you were mentioning prior to that, like, it's kind of, it can go either way. Like monogamy can be an issue with
Hmm.
nuclear family dynamics, and or it can be an issue with this other progressive thing. Like
Yeah.
it's sort of like, I think that's interesting. I haven't heard of that before,
Yeah.
that term before, you know.
Yeah. Omniamory sounds like trying to rebrand polyamory.
Yeah. But like, so for example,
But
if you were in a monogamous relationship and
mhm,
after 20 years that was working, but you want to evolve the level of your intimacy, like let's say
mhm,
you're in a 20-year relationship and want to evolve the level of your intimacy while still keeping your partnership intact and you're with this person intact, but you want to try and explore
mhm,
holding other forms of relating, which goes by a different label as poly, that would
mhm.
be what he would call, right, omni-amory. But that's not like
Right.
a label he's saying like
Right.
that's what
Right.
it is. He's just
Right.
saying he identifies more with that term because you could start off poly and want to go monogamous or vice versa. Like,
Right. Yeah, that's where the labels get really tricky, and then all that over communication to me is um it means you really didn't get the memo about what it is to release to have love outside of the with the absence of fear, like that there's this concept that a lot of these, this was at Tamara Healing Biotope in Portugal,
yeah.
where they practice it in a very specific way. Their whole dialogue is around how do we release love? How do we love without the presence of fear? Uh, and and how do we essentially heal the world by healing the rift between, in their languages it's men and women. They have some development to do, once you get into the more nuanced conversation around gender and gender roles and all of that. But let's just put a pin in that aspect of the conversation. Their primary thesis was, when they started, like back in the 70s, they're saying all of our intentional communities are falling apart, either due to money or relationships slash eros gone amok. And they kind of correlated all the troubles of the world, the wars and all of that are like ripple effects to many dimensions, exacerbated from the tension between the sexes. And that if they could really kind of create an environment where love could be practiced without fear, and with real processes in place. They call it a forum. They do it daily, few hours of people, of their members sitting in circle, bringing up whatever's there with a whole ton of group modalities to help process through anything that comes up. But a very significant part of their model is take away all the pressures that go on to a nuclear family by having a really robust community container. So a lot of your existential issues that are tied into who you're with evaporate. So now you can really be like, you're not trying to make that partner be everything. And it's recognized that eros comes and goes, and that really what you're trying to, if you want a really healthy community, is like don't, like, yes, the mother and father, no one's going to love their children as much as the mother and father. Like, you don't interfere with that dynamic, but you also
Mhm.
don't isolate that group from the greater community container. And part of their thing is, you may have one lover, you may have one partner for life, or you might not. You might have multiple. You might have a couple at once. I mean, they don't really put a lot of rules on that, as much as they're saying it can't be disingenuous. You can't be a predator. You're nurturing actual love dynamics. And the part that really stood out for me was just realizing how many times in a very specific relationship where it was very intense, like the jealousy level was really, really high, and the fear around loss and all of this stuff was just hung like an oppressive cloud over the whole thing. Um, is that you essentially create prisons for each other through these relationships, and they're not really loving. And that in that context, what kind of connections could you make that never have to go sexual but go deep in terms of love? I mean, I find that I get to, as a single person, I get to do that with my life. I get to have a lot of deep, really good friendships with women that would likely be, have to, be de-emphasized if I was in a relationship. There would have to be in, and these are things that they're subtle, like, oh, but don't you want to be more connected? Isn't it nice to have that thing? And can't you go deeper? um in an ideal world, yeah. But I think the way we're set up, because there's so much that comes up in terms of, well, what if I'm not being picked, or I'm not, like, there's a kind of like where it just creates so much material for more complexes to emerge and more distance to emerge. And I think the most healthy relationships are the ones where you almost don't have a honeymoon period. You kind of just start relating to that person as another human being from the beginning. And can you do that and have a deep erotic connection and have a good friendship and have a good romance? Like, you know, there's a kind of over idealized vision I'm painting here, but I think in doing so, you can really see the flaws in what to me is like considered the most encouraged relationship model, which to me feels just really restricting for everybody involved.
Hmm. Yeah, what's his name? One of these directors that I really appreciate that I was supporting for a little while was Ian McKenzie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Oh
know
yeah,
if you know.
yeah.
Ian McKenzie, yeah. After I saw Sacred Economics, um, with his
Charles.
interview, the short film with Charles
Mhm.
Eisenstein, I was like, oh, it was my gospel. It was such a validation of the work that I'd
Mhm.
already been doing on indigenous holistic economics. And when I saw this, and it like just blew my mind open, I think. And um, I immediately was like, I want to support what you're doing, Ian McKenzie. And he came up with a project over the years afterwards on Tamara, the
Yeah,
love.
the Village of Lovers film. Yeah.
Yeah. And the question that I had for him to ask them was related to support and related to like if you were a poly couple, like in a not just psi, but like in a hetero society, in a hetero culture, in a hetero community, how would you be able to navigate this? And their response was like, it's really very hard, like almost like swimming upstream, because in a in a polyamorous community, the elders are who they go to, the people who've been doing this for 20 years and they've seen
Mhm.
every dynamic and form of like conflict arise. They become, even if they're not even active anymore, they become a resource then that kind of like feed nutrients to the forest, to the new saplings that are trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
um, to to be like a repository, like a functioning
Mhm.
repository of wisdom for
Yeah.
the people that are navigating this,
Yeah.
which made a lot of sense to me, and that's part of, yeah. But I don't know. I think I feel fine with with like right now with my current
Yeah.
situation. I don't. There's times sure I'll like want to snuggle with someone, but not beyond that. Like I don't feel
Mhm.
like I need that. Um, you know,
Yeah.
that's it doesn't need to necessarily be sexualized for me to experience connection in a way that is not monogamous. I don't need
Yeah.
um I guess breach or even have a desire to go beyond monogamy if I'm able to have that connection where I'm just, maybe it's a conversation or whatever,
Yeah.
that doesn't need to be like, it's still within my friendship.
Yeah. 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 That's and to me, it's all about choice. It's like, is it how do our community agreements, our social agreements support us in being in a truly loving space, in a truly free space, to where the real restrictions are really environmental. They're more of like environmental, not stuff that we constructed to hold each other in boxes or pin each other down in certain ways. And you could choose either one in an ideal world that's authentic, you know and there's plenty of community wisdom that puts the fuck boy in check, you know that puts the overly not overly promiscuous, but because that sounds very judgment oriented, but let's say someone who's finding that he or she doesn't feel valued unless they're providing sex, like a healthy community would point that out as well. A healthy community that is dealing with these things in a responsible way. But I've had um, very real experiences of feeling very deep love for more than one person, and I've also had a very real experience of feeling a very deep love for only one person, and not needing to have a sex life out, just to have one, and that's, probably accounts for most of my choices around my sexual life these days, which is not, I don't know that I'm celibate by choice or not choice, but it just is like, I had my last relationship and had, you know, an experience a few months after that ended, and was like, you know, it could also be that I'm like 53 and it's just like, it's not like I can't go there, but I'm like not trying to like I used to. And, it felt like a much more important dynamic to be accessing. And, but I want to feel like I wouldn't, if I found somebody, I wouldn't want to like all of a sudden have to change the way I communicate with some of my friends because now I'm in a relationship and it's like I've got to like, also, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to be with someone who's just basically, you know, kind of all over the place if they were totally into me in a weird gotta like keep the balance kind of a thing. So I don't know these, and how this ties into, I think, this bigger conversation of the world is the granularity of these dynamics have to be monitored at the most minute level, which is interpersonally. Being clean with everyone I encounter is the foundation for a healthy community fabric. And I don't like to have out of uh, say things you don't get to talk about because you're trying to preserve people's feelings, you know, and but you can't really preserve people's feelings without having a good container for them too and creating that. And I think that there's that's where the community conversation, the personal, who am I in community with right now, just feels like such a, and how am I cultivating it? How does every person that I consider in my local community a touch point and a reflector on how good of a citizen am I being? And if everyone's bringing that attention to their community dynamics, it's going to reverberate out into the world and up into these world conflicts.
Right. I think I'm getting a little dwindling. It's like 2:35 now, my time. It's
Cool.
this
I love
afternoon.
it.
I think I'm feeling a little complete or feeling
Well,
complete.
I love that. I love that we went long form and we because that's what I want. I only want long form, real conversations. And
Hmm.
but yeah, thank you so much. Um,
Yeah.
I will
I,
reach out
I,
when I have another guest lined up, and I'm going to invite you on. I won't tell you who it is yet because I need
okay.
to plan that, but um, no need to commit on record. But I'm definitely going to invite you back to have some of these conversations, as many as we can this year.
Sure. Yeah, that would be really great. And I like this talking with you like on this platform is no different than when we're talking in private. It's
Yeah.
you're right. I was like, I don't know. Like
Yeah.
but no, it was fine. It was exactly like you said, just totally organic. It's just us talking.
Yeah. 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 All right. Well, thank you for joining. Listener, viewer, thank you for listening. And I'll see you next moon.
Yay. Thank you.